Welcome to the Reverie Nature Podcast. I'm your host, Chad Clifford, and today we're exploring the hidden treasure beneath the forest floor, evergreen tree roots. From crafting tools and building shelters, evergreen roots are a versatile resource for any bushcrafter or survivalist. They're fast to collect, and you can get them while you're traveling. So whether you're a seasoned bushcrafter or just getting started, this episode will have some valuable knowledge to help you uncover and identify the right trees, how to prepare the roots, and utilize them in various scenarios. In the Reverie Nature Podcast, you can expect to find a wide variety of topics on the nature experience, from bushcraft, survival skills, nature lore, animal tracks and sign, storytelling, nature soundscapes, and much more. These are the lessons and skills I've been teaching for decades. So before we dig in, please take a moment to subscribe and consider offering your support to the podcast. Evergreen roots. So what can you make with these roots? Well, think of the birch bark canoe. The whole thing is lashed and sewn together with spruce roots. Besides the birch bark boats, you can make birch bark crafts, making a rim around a little container, lashing the rim onto the container. You can use it as an emergency shoelace. You can lash almost anything you can imagine with roots. The thing is with roots, once they dry out, it's not a matter of re-soaking them. They turn brittle and that's it. They take that initial shape, dry out, and they're done. So while they last a long time and they're durable, you don't reuse them in the sense of untying it like a rope. So what to look for if you need some lashing? You want a stand of evergreen, ideally spruce trees. So although any evergreen root is not too bad, spruce roots are usually considered the best. When I'm looking for roots, I'm not quite as picky. If I'm in a forest with some cedar, I'll use those. Whatever it is, I don't mind. The evergreen roots, they tend to have a red skin over them. So when you're in a forest and you're digging for roots, what root are you coming across? Right? If you're surrounded by evergreen trees, okay, you can be assured that it's an evergreen root. But otherwise, there's other roots mixed in if it's more of a mixed forest that you're in. So you're looking for the roots that have a orange or reddish skin over the roots. You also want to be picky with the soil type too. You don't want to be digging in hard soil, right? It's just too much work. What you want is ideally a damp or loamy area. So when you start peeling back the moss or digging into the dirt, it's soft, it's easy to pull up the roots. And remember, you're not there to make a mess. When I'm pulling out a root, I'm digging up some of the soil. I'm not digging very deep, 6 inches maybe at the most. And as I'm lifting up the soil, I'm following a root along. I'm lifting the soil as I go. You don't just grab a root and yank on it. It will break. And it'll break quickly because it's usually intertwined with other roots, crossing and weaving. So you really have to untangle it from under the soil. So gently lift off the soil you need. Put that soil back when you're done. You can have that area pretty much look the way you arrived. So don't go in there and just make a mess and dig everything up and expose the other roots to the air and therefore dryness. It's not good for the trees. Speaking of how much harm we're doing by taking roots, remember, there's a lot of roots underground. What you see above the ground, tree-wise, there's a whole lot of roots supporting that. So there are a lot of roots. If you're just looking for 10 feet of roots, you're not going to hurt a tree. At the same time, if the tree's only 2 inches in diameter, yeah, you're going to kill it. But, you want roots from larger trees. So if there's a stand of small, younger trees, probably best to just avoid that area, move on. And that comes to digging. How do you dig up the soil? Well, I did say you wanted soft soil. You don't want to dig with your fingers necessarily. I often have done it this way, and what happens is as you're digging in the soil or clawing through the soil, that soil gets under your fingernails and it compacts under there, and you, you almost get infections under your fingernails because you need to trim your nails, but the soil gets pushed so far down under your nails that it's kind of hard to get out later. So avoid that. It's very natural to just want to dig with your fingers because you're in kind of a messy situation trying to untangle and move soil around. But get a digging stick, just a stick the diameter of maybe 2 inches or even the diameter of your thumb if it's a strong stick, just to help you do some of the digging. It takes longer, it's a bit of a nuisance, but it's worth it. Get yourself a little digging stick, and you don't have to be picky about the digging stick, but you should avoid getting all this dirt under your nails because that will be a nuisance later. Besides a loamy soil or a soft soil, you want an area that potentially is on a slope. So if you are in an area where there is a slope, don't choose the high side, choose the low side. The roots are looking for water. Yes, they're there for support too. There will be roots on the high side, but I find the lower side of the tree is where I go for digging for roots, especially if the soil's soft. I don't even bother trying if the soil's hard because it's just too much work and too hard to get the roots out of there. So the next question would be, when you see a large evergreen tree or your spruce tree, how far away from the tree do you need to be? Well, you don't have to be that far, but you don't really want to necessarily be that close either. Obviously, the larger roots tend to be closer to the tree and they branch off like an artery with veins in it. So, you can be 10 feet away, no problem there. That's generally probably where I'd start looking for a larger tree. I'd look for a soft soil area, down slope if there is a slope, and I'll go 6 inches in if the soil's soft. And if I don't find anything right away, I move. Just another foot over. I just kind of look around a little bit until I get onto one. It's usually pretty quick in the finding. And remember, you're looking for a root with an orange skin on it. The size of root you want, you don't, depends on the craft or what you need the roots for. But generally, I never get something as large as the diameter of one of my fingers, for instance. I'm looking for, at the most, pencil diameter roots. Because even though that's still an awfully big root, even that is a little on the large side, perhaps, because you're probably going to be splitting these roots. You're not just going to use them whole. If you do find smaller roots, like the size of a diameter of maybe 3 or 4 millimeters, those are fine too, but you don't tend to split those ones. You use those ones whole or round. As far as the length of the root you want to get, if you need, say, 10 feet of root, each root that you collect, you don't want little short 8-inch, 10-inch pieces. Take your time, follow that root along until it just gets too difficult. Sometimes these roots will do a deep dive under a larger root, and it just gets a little too hard to follow or to dig for. At that point, yeah, just if you have a long enough length, go ahead and break it. You can also use your knife to cut it. Just be aware that in the soil with all the grit, using your knife to cut it, if it hits the soil much, will dull your knife a little bit. I often tend to just pull and break the root because I'm not getting large diameter roots, right? So pull it off, break it. You want at least a 2-foot section, ideally, to be useful. Don't over harvest, that's for sure. You're digging up the soil, you're pulling roots. You're not really hurting the tree that much by just pulling these small little roots, especially if it's a large tree and you're not taking much. But you don't want to over harvest either and take more than you need. So take what you need, leave the rest, return that area to the way it was. Put the soil back in place. You haven't probably displaced much soil, but you've certainly disturbed it. So pack that in, give it a little press down. I even go as far as whisking whatever pine needles or whatever it is in the area just to really cover up what I've done and to make it look like I was not even there. And that's the thing with bushcraft and survival skills, isn't it? You are taking things from the woods. You're using things, you're cutting down saplings. You need to be aware of what you're doing. You don't want to just take any old sapling. You're being choosy. What are you being choosy about? Well, for the craft you're doing as well, but you also are concerned with the environment. You don't want to make a mess. In other words, you don't want to make things worse. So if I can use the example of collecting a sapling for, I don't know, say making a pair of tongs, where I need about an inch diameter piece of wood, a live piece of wood like a sapling, I don't just go find the nearest sapling. I know what species of tree I want. It tends to be like a young maple. But I don't just go grab a young maple sapling. I look for a cluster of maples. So if there's a little cluster of these trees growing up, like 10 or 11, all clustered together, those are going to support each other as they grow, but they die off. There's only going to be one or two trees in that mix that are going to grow. They're competing for light and whatnot. So I'll take one of those and lessen my impact on the environment, because bushcrafting does have an impact. You just got to watch what you're doing and control that impact so it does not harm the environment. And some people argue you're actually improving things. It might be a hard pill to swallow, that one, but you can see it though. You're with the example I just used, thinning out the maples, but they do need each other for support as they grow up. So you never over harvest. Same goes with wild edibles. If you're picking leaves for a tea, whatnot, you don't just harvest from one plant. If that plant has 10 leaves on it, take one or two. Certainly don't take 30% of them, right? So you got to be mindful of these things. And if you're sharing these skills, absolutely make sure you share them properly with the right attitude. Because if you don't model your instruction, guess what the next person's going to do? And when they pass it on to their friend, it's just going to turn into a mess, right? So be respectful. Okay, enough preaching. So let's get back to digging roots. As you dig the roots, you have the red skin on the roots. You need to keep these damp. If you're going to be using them right away or within half an hour, no problem. But if you're not going to use them for a few hours, you better get these into water. Put them in a stream with a weight on them, or have a bucket with you with some water in it. You need to keep these soaking. And if they start drying out, they lose, their flexibility. And you can keep them for a long time. Once they're in water, they're fine. It's going to take a very long time for them to rot or anything like that. So with your longer lengths of root, you need to coil them up. Keep them nice and tidy. Put them in a long coil. They won't unravel. They just don't. They're sort of stiff in a way, so that'll be fine in the bucket. Different little coils. If you don't do that, you're just going to have a tangled mess. So let's get on to the next step, and that's preparing the roots. So you have your bucket of roots. They're all in little coils. Now you've left the skin on. That helps them keep the moisture in. So I would just leave that skin on right until you're about to use them. And how do you get that reddish skin off? Well, a lot of people use their nails and they peel away, and it comes off in, pretty easily in long lengths. So it's not too much of a nuisance to get off, but it does take some time. There is some tricks for that. I've come across people building birch bark canoes and this and stuff, doing demonstrations, and I've noticed sometimes on a few occasions people would be trying to get that skin off the root. And you can leave that skin on if you're in a rush. It depends what you're doing. If you want a nice, clean looking craft afterwards, yeah, take off the skin, but it doesn't really matter otherwise. But I always tend to take off the skin myself. So when you take the skin off, yeah, you can use your nails and it's a little tedious. Well, here's a really good trick. When I was shown how to make a birch bark canoe, this is what we did, and it worked really, really well. So next thing you have to do this is you need to grab a piece of wood or branch, the diameter of about 2 inches, and I'd say about 4 or 5 inches long. It can be a little longer, it doesn't matter, as long as it's not shorter. And what you do with this 2-inch diameter branch is you take your knife. If you know how to do splitting with a knife, you put the knife onto the center of the branch as the branch is standing on a steady surface, and you tap your knife through that to split the wood. And if you don't know about safe knife use, yeah, you need to learn safe knife use before you start doing bushcraft, that's for sure. Anyway, split that branch into 2 halves. Once it's in 2 halves, you hold the 2 halves, you put them back together, hold them in your hand, and then what you do is you put the root between. So what you're going to be doing is where you've put the branch back together, you drag the root through through it. So through where your split was. So in other words, you have one half, you put a root on it, you put the other half back on top the way it initially was, and you pull the root through. And what this does is it peels or scrapes the root off for you. You just pull the root through, and even if it's a 5 foot length, whatever it is, you keep pulling it through, being mindful of if it's a thinner root, it could break if you pull too hard, and it just peels all that exterior bark, reddish bark off the root. It works really well, and the stuff it doesn't get off, it'll be off in long strands, and the parts you missed, you can probably just pull those strands and the rest will come off, or run it through this again. What I actually do sometimes, if I have a lot of roots I'm doing, is I will take my branch, I'll use a slightly longer one, maybe 5 to 8 inches. I'll split the branch, and then I'll actually lash with roots. I'll lash that branch back together on one end. So it's like I'm repairing the branch that I just split, right? So I got it lashed on one end with rope, roots, whatever, instead of just holding it with your hand. That way it stays together. And then on the other end, you just open it up enough to get a root in the crack there, and then you just squeeze as much as need be to offer enough resistance to get that coating of the roots to peel off. And you'd be surprised how many people don't know that little trick. It just makes all the difference, and it works so well, and it's easy to do. So now that you have roots with the bark, I guess we'll call it a bark or a sheath, peeled off, definitely get them back in the water if you're not going to use them right away. You should be using them pretty soon though, because now you've peeled off the skin, and although you're in no rush if you're leaving them in water, yeah, they just, they're aging, they're drying out slowly unless they're in water. So you need to be mindful of that. And now it's time to split the roots. And that's there's a knack to that too. And what I mean by splitting roots, if the diameter is a little on the big side of the root you've collected and you want a different size diameter, you'll probably start with a knife or maybe just your fingernails depending on the root. You want to get that root to start splitting down the center. So you have this round root and split it down the center, and then you just pull the two halves apart. It's not as easy as it sounds, I'll tell you that, because if you just take the peeling and you start pulling on two ends, it will not peel straight down the root, and you'll have one long piece and one short piece, and you're kind of making a mess, and you'll have uneven lengths, uneven diameters in the length, even though it's not a diameter now once you split it. So here's the trick. It's easier to show or demonstrate, but I think I can describe this well enough. You take your root, once you've started the split in the top of your root, let's say, you squeeze the root and you have it hanging, you squeeze the root between your knuckles of both hands. So if you imagine putting your fingernails together from both hands, with your fingers kind of pointing towards you at this point, the root's in between all that. All right, you're holding the top of the root, the rest of it's dangling from your hands, and you got your knuckles kind of squeezed together, holding the root in place. With your opposable thumbs, what you do then is from the top, you start splitting that root, and you start peeling it by holding it with your thumbs each side and pulling it open with the pivoting motion of your wrists, I guess, and you're pulling them apart. As you do this, you'll notice that even though you're trying to do this evenly with both thumbs pulling it apart with equal pressure, the root will still not split evenly. Here's the trick. When there's one side of the root that is a little thicker, because as you're splitting it, it's not splitting down the center, what you do at that point is you take the thicker side, the side that's being a bully, hogging too much of the root, you only bend that side. So as you're splitting it, you're pulling only on the thicker side, and that will bring the split back into the center. And once it's back into the center, go back to evenly splitting the root by pulling on both sides of the root equally, and you'll be able to split it right down the center that way pretty easily. You will come to kinks, or I wouldn't call them knots, but there's kinks in the roots from the way they've had to grow underground. those kinks can be split right through. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're just awkward or it's a sharp kink and you get a little stuck there. You just have to work around that. Now you'll have root that's split in half. And what happens with the split root, it sits nicely on your craft, doesn't it? And you have a nice flat surface of that root. It helps bind better when it's split like that. You can certainly split it into quarters too. You just start the process over again. In future episodes, I'm going to have a bunch of crafts where I do make use of short amounts of root, so stay tuned for that. There are alternatives to using roots too. You can use cane. You know the wicking that you use in chairs? Those, I don't know if you call them wicker chairs, those old-fashioned wooden chairs with they got the nice mesh of natural material that you sit on or for the back piece. That's typically cane, and you can buy that at craft stores in long rolls, this cane. Cane works just great. I've even used it on birch bark crafts before. What I have noticed, though, is the cane in weather dries out and it gets brittle, and it tends to wear out faster than roots. Roots are better in my opinion, but cane is sure convenient. On my birch bark canoe, where I ran out of roots at one point, so we switched to cane in the building. And yeah, it was the cane later that actually had to be replaced. The roots all held fine. It was those areas of cane that actually wore out. Anyway, I don't want to get too long in the tooth here. There will be a few crafts that I talk about in future episodes that will make use of using roots. So this is our resource for that. So remember, be respectful on how you collect any natural fiber or whatever it is you're doing in bushcraft. Do not make a mess. Be respectful. Teach the same. Thank you for joining us on the Reverie Nature Podcast. Remember to subscribe for more captivating episodes exploring the wonders of the natural world. Until next time, may you saunter forth, embracing nature's song, and may the whispers of the wilderness linger in your heart. And floating above the forest where